Welcome to the GOYA Gatherings Podcast, a serene and inspiring space where the worlds of yoga and wellness converge. Every episode is a journey into the heart of yoga, offering you deep insights, uplifting stories, and practical wisdom. Our conversations are designed to inspire your journey and illuminate your path to well-being. Please remember that the views expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of GOYA Gatherings or its hosts.
Welcome to the GOYA Gatherings Podcast. My name is Mark. I'm part of the leadership team here at GOYA and incredibly excited to welcome Karen Fabian to the podcast today. Hi, Karen.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really psyched to be here.
Us too. So Karen is the founder of Bare Bones Yoga. And we're here today to talk about a new framework that you've put together called the confidence practice. And I'm not going to say much more about you because I'd love for you to be the person who shares about you. So we'll just dive in. And can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So thanks again for having me on the show. I'm really excited to be here and have this opportunity to meet you and to talk to your listeners. I think one of the things I can start out with, I've been teaching yoga for 22 years, and I can go into a lot of my background, and I'm sure we'll cover that at some point. I want to just start, though, with a quick story that I'm just inspired to share, given what we're going to be talking about. I can remember when I was asked to teach an anatomy training for yoga teachers, and my expertise is in anatomy. And I remember I went to teach this training, and as I was setting up my stuff, some of the participants were coming in, and I was chatting with one of them, and she said in the first few seconds that she was a physical therapist. And as soon as she said that, I immediately started to get flushed. I started to feel like I was going to pass out because in my head, I was thinking, who am I to be teaching anatomy to this person who's a physical therapist? And I went to the bathroom and I splashed cold water on my face and I was like, get it together. And I went out and I taught the workshop, and I had my skeleton with me. And this was in the early days of my teaching anatomy to teachers. And after the training, she came up to me and she said, I've got to tell you, even though I understand anatomy for physical therapy, I realized I didn't understand anatomy for yoga teaching, and I learned so much. And so in that moment, I realized that transformative feeling of really believing in myself, feeling confident, and feeling expert enough, feeling valued, feeling competent. And all of these feelings are many times what teachers tell me they want to feel. And it may not specifically be around anatomy, but in general, they sort of roll up to this feeling of, I want to feel like I know what I'm doing. I don't want to second guess myself anymore. And so although I've been teaching for 22 years and I've written a couple books for teachers, and, I have a podcast with over 300 episodes called Conversations for Yoga Teachers, the real work that I do is leveraging this idea of feeling confident, especially for yoga teachers, because in my signature program, which does focus in part on anatomy, the bulk of what I hear from people isn't always, I want to learn anatomy. It's more often, I want to feel confident. And in 2023, which is only 2 years ago, I had the most ever students enroll in my program. And it was number one thing they always wanted to feel, which was more confident. And so that just became sort of this recurring theme. And it allowed me to really examine, through working with these teachers, what were some of the blocks that they were facing. So, that's the primary work that I do now. I have a signature program. I have a membership. I work with yoga teachers, both one-on-one in the regular program and in this group membership. And even though I do teach some public classes, the majority of the 20 some odd years I taught public classes has sort of become an adjunct experience for me because I have this kind of scalable, it's online opportunity to work with teachers. And I love doing that. My original background, I thought interestingly enough, wanted to be a physical therapist. So when I went to undergraduate school at Boston University, I live here in Boston, that was my original path. And then I realized a couple of years in, I think I want to work with the whole person. And so I ended up switching programs and worked as a rehab counselor after I graduated. I worked as a social worker, but I was always working in healthcare settings. So I was like the adjunct to the orthopedic, the nurse, the PT, the OT, the speech therapist, and me. And so I got a real good clinical background on injury management, functional medicine, functional movement, applying anatomy to movement. And then I had other jobs that I worked in healthcare, consulting, and insurance and that sort of thing. But then I took my first yoga class in 1999 with Karen Baptiste, who was my first teacher here in Boston. And I had that sort of experience that many people describe, that aha moment in my first class, where I just felt like, wow, this is just such an amazing amalgam of all the things I love about the mind, the body, the fitness, the exercise, the anatomy to movement. And I really pretty much knew at that point I wanted to teach full time. So at that point, I was working in a very good job, making very good money. And part of me was like, why would I be crazy to leave that to teach yoga? And this was in 2002 when there weren't a lot of studios, but I really knew that was my path. And so I engineered a plan over about a period of 11, 12 months. I quit my job. I put money in the bank. I sold my condo. I got a job working full time for Karen Baptiste. I taught in the studio. I worked for him kind of behind the scenes. This was really in the beginning of just yoga starting to explode here in Boston and even in the United States. More studios were popping up. People were going away for teacher trainings, and that whole sort of emergence of yoga in the United States was happening. And I did that for a couple of years. And then I really wanted to be my own teacher. I really didn't want to be under the auspices of somebody else's brand and methodology. And I wanted to do other things as me. And so interestingly enough, this was around 2008, 2009, when there was a big crash in the economy. And so a lot of my students couldn't come to my public classes because they had lost their jobs. And so I found this really unique space. It was a renovated garage, like go to get gas kind of thing. And I offered classes in this renovated garage. It was sort of like, if you remember those old Janet Jackson videos where it was like very industrial and she was doing like all the dancing. It looked like that. And I called the space Bare Bones Yoga because it was bare bones. You came with whatever you needed. You paid $10 and I would teach you class. And I did that for a number of months until they needed the space back. But I kept the name because it really reflected my focus on functional movement, my love of anatomy, my expertise in teaching it, and that sort of thing. And that really was the genesis of me going out on my own, creating my own business, building my brand, writing books, creating the podcast, starting to create a program where I could work with teachers anywhere. I was looking at the model of teaching classes and I was thinking, this isn't going to sustain me, in terms of just paying the bills. And it took a while to sort of get the right mixture of things going to get something that was really sustainable from the business point of view. And I made a lot of mistakes along the way. My first book actually is all about a lot of the mistakes I made because I don't want other people to make them. I mean, at one point I was $30,000 in debt when I was teaching for the studio because I wasn't making enough teaching and my bills were still there. And I just got to a point where it was like, this isn't working. And so that was a whole other story of how I got out of debt. But I knew at that point, number one, there's lessons here that I can share. And that one in the first book. And also there needs to be a different way that I diversify what I'm doing so that I can create a business that can support me. And that in large part came from creating my own programs. So now the bulk of what I do, like I said, I teach some public classes, and the majority of the work I do is supporting the teachers in the Yoga Teacher Confidence Club, which is the month-to-month membership, and also my primary program, which is focused on confidence, skills, and anatomy.
Wow, that's quite the story. I love now you've shared some background on the name. I love it for so many reasons, but also that I think that it highlights the importance of like the foundations of learning to be a yoga teacher, and that those bare bones are so important. And hopefully we can tie that into what we're going to talk about today, which is confidence and where confidence comes from.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, one of the sayings that I say over and over again to teachers when I work with them is, when you speak from what you know, your confidence grows. And this whole idea of making a connection between, if we just look at it through the lens of teaching yoga, there's the cue that I say, but then behind what I'm saying is, what does it mean? And many times, you can have an experience as a teacher of just saying the cue without really understanding the reason for it. And that doesn't just apply to anatomical based cues. It could apply to an action cue or a somatic cue or an alignment cue. But because of the nature of teaching, no one's really asking us questions along the way, which is one of the challenges that teachers face. They're sort of in this room just talking out into thin air. And if they're not watching their students, they don't really know, are these people getting it? And yet they could be sharing things where if someone was able to ask a question in the moment, they might realize, I'm not really sure why I'm asking you to tuck your tail or align your knee over your heel or whatever it is. Sometimes when I have conversations with teachers, they'll say, well, that's what I was trained to say. And that always sort of breaks my heart, because that's such a disempowering statement. It's like, well, that's what I was trained to say. I don't really know why I'm saying it. I've sort of deferred, to the person who trained me. And, when I think about the definition of empowerment for yoga teachers, it's not about having power over our students. It's about being empowered, embodying the sense of power over what I'm doing. I'm sharing something that I could explain, in part because I've had people after class stop and say, hey, what does that cue mean? When we were in down dog, you were asking us to roll the inner eyes, the elbows forward. What does that mean? And what a great opportunity to have a really meaningful conversation with a student. And when it happens, they'll often say like, wow, I'll never think of that pose the same way again. This has been so cool. And I think of that as a way to really shift not only your own experience as a teacher in terms of making an impact and adding value, but to shift for the student the experience of your class from just a transactional thing to a transformational experience where they're not just doing the yoga, they're learning about yoga. Asking a question is a sign to me from a student that they're really engaged in the experience and they want to know more. And that, to me, is so much part of the feedback loop to the teacher that lights you up, even more so than if somebody says, oh, I loved your class. Like, that's nice. But this other stuff is so much more impactful to me when it comes to the joy that I get. And when I, speak with teachers and coach them, they relate to this, kind of feedback loop to them.
You made me remember a moment in my teaching career where teaching a public class, and a new student to me asked me why in the middle of the class. I said something and she was like, but why? And I remember thinking like, oh, this doesn't happen. This doesn't happen. This doesn't happen. How do I deal with this in this moment?
Yes.
Like, this is not the etiquette of a yoga class. And then I thought, well, why not? Like, why can't we have a conversation right now about why I'm suggesting this and go even deeper into some of the intricacies and the options that maybe I wouldn't have time for. And it ended up being a really great class. And she kept coming back, and this student didn't ask why so much, but we had conversations more before class and after class because they were just really inquisitive. And you made me think about how there's kind of an unspoken etiquette in a yoga class where we don't question the person telling us what to do generally. And and along with that comes a pressure from then the teacher to feel perfect and there's so much unspoken that I think that if we do have a student who can be, well, why? It's such a good learning opportunity for us to really think about what it is that we're saying, because I think a lot of us, as you mentioned, just learn what we're told to say. We just learn to say this cue at this time, at this moment in the class, and don't think about it any further.
Exactly.
But
And I've had students as well speak up sometimes, and it is a little jolting because you're used to that sort of serene vibe. However, this is one of the reasons why when I work with teachers around this concept of the walk and talk versus the practice with me approach, which is a technique that I train teachers to do. And for many of them, the reason I share it with them as an option is because number one, they oftentimes have never been taught how to walk around the room and teach versus practicing with their students. And there's lots of reasons for that. But number two, it also allows them to get to a point where they're so good at their sequence that they don't have to think about what comes next. And when you don't have to spend as much time thinking about what you're doing, you have so much more mental space in your brain for these sorts of things that you could never plan for that would come up. The person that asks a question, the person that leaves early that in the past might have freaked you out, that now is like, okay, well, I'm just so much more centered because I know what I'm doing, that I don't get freaked out about that or whatever it is. So that I was just reminded of that as you were speaking. And then the other thing to keep in mind, and I appreciate what you're saying about this, you're sort of talking out into the air and, you're kind of potentially saying things that maybe you're not really sure of. This idea of confidence is also tied to, even if someone doesn't ask a question in the moment or after class, there's still the knowing that the teacher has when they share a cue from what they know versus what they were just told to say. And in the sharing of the cue where there is an understanding of the why behind it, that is a transformational way of teaching versus the repeater way, right? So there's the repeater and there's the teacher. And we're not talking bad or wrong here. Many times, think of the first year that all of us taught yoga, we essentially were repeaters, right? That was what we could leverage because we didn't have a bank of experience to leverage. At some point, though, I help teachers develop this inquisitiveness around, well, why is it like that? Because for many of them, even in teacher training, they didn't really ask why. And so it was sort of this, how many times have you heard, oh, my 200-hour training was just so much information. It was like so much overload. It was like dumping into my brain, like so many. And I've taught the anatomy part of so many teacher trainings. I've seen them like, tell me and heard them tell me these stories. And so in that, it's not even that you're voluntarily abdicating to the person who's training you. You just only have so much mental capacity to absorb and then to additionally ask why. For many teachers, it's like, oh, fine, just tell me what I'm supposed to say. So, this idea of speaking from what you know is in part tied to confidence, because even if you're not sharing the why in your cue, you still know in your part, in your brain, I could explain this if somebody asks me. And so now, even your voice when you're saying the cue, a lot of times when I listen to podcasts, and I'm sure you hear this too, now that I'm bringing it up, you'll probably hear it a lot more, this up talking technique where people say, well, I don't really know, or no. Like, even if they're not asking a question or stating something that ends with a question mark, the voice trails up. And to me, when I hear that, that's a sign of, I'm not really sure, or I'm not really confident. And the voice is a tell to what the inner story is. And as a yoga teacher, we've only got so many tools at our disposal. And once we start doing things like the walk and talk, we're not using our body as a tool. So the voice becomes so much more important. So when I'm speaking from what I know, I have conviction, I have clarity, and I can build connection. And the reason I have conviction, a belief in what I'm saying, is because behind what I'm saying, I know what I'm talking about. So my voice sounds different. Right. So even now, as I'm sharing this with you, because I've been teaching these principles in my own teaching methodology for years, I'm very confident in what I'm saying. So there's no, there's no, like, I'm not saying it like, what do you think, Mark? Do you agree with this? Like, I'm not looking for your approval because I believe in what I'm saying. And as a teacher, when you go in the room and you're fueled by this confident feeling, your vocal quality will change and people will will feel that in their bodies when you are talking. It's like you'll be speaking right to their nervous system versus, we all kind of have that teachery voice we can do, or maybe when we were newer, we mimicked our teacher who trained us. I did the same thing, like in many ways. So it's just another expression of the knowing and the confidence through the voice.
Do you think that, I could talk to you about voice all day as someone who studied opera and singing. I've had instances where I was singing in a recital and my partner would say, I was really nervous for you the whole time because I was nervous. Like it comes through the voice. And then other times where I felt prepared, which for me was my key for confidence, was preparation. And I'd feel great. And then the feedback I'd get was like, oh, you looked really comfortable up there. And so the energy that comes to the voice really hits home for me as something that it tells so much.
Right.
But I wondered if you could speak to like the larger reason why maybe yoga teachers feel unconfident, because it's not an isolated thing. It comes up a lot, especially newer teachers. How do I know when I'm ready to teach? I don't feel confident up in front of a class. Like, what have you isolated, or do you have some insights you can share about why that might be?
Yeah, totally. And before I talk to that, I also want to just share, when you talked about your background as a singer, one of the most fascinating things that I like to do, and I encourage all the teachers I work with or any of your listeners to do, especially if you're a yoga teacher, is to watch American Idol. Because when you watch American Idol, you get to see the rawness of the person. And I'm talking American Idol before they make it to the finals, like those first couple of weeks where it's just the people walk in, you visually assess, like we all do it, and then you listen and you can tell, is the person mimicking? Is the person faking? Is the person doubtful? Is the person fearful? Like you can hear it all in their voice. And it's such an interesting way to observe people and then pull lessons from that and see, introspectively for yourself, well, how might I come across? So I always throw that out there as a nice, as an interesting exercise to do. And I think in February, the new round of shows comes out. So so that's always
fun too.
Yeah, I'm always watching that. But so here's the thing, because I've worked with a number of teachers and I've noticed from the high level, from this sort of upper level, looking down at the whole situation of all the teachers I've worked with, the common threads, right? So almost like from the point of view of like a scientific study, I'm able to pull out what are some of the common trends I've seen, what are some of the common problems that they have. And I was always so interested as I was running this program and continue to run it, why is there this common thread, as you say, around confidence, not feeling confident? And one of the things that I think, and this is why you'll be able to relate to this and people listening who are yoga teachers will, there's something very unique to teaching yoga that is very triggering for people. And I believe it's not just that we are essentially public speakers. And I think if you ask many, many people, what's one of the big fears you have, people will generally say public speaking is a big fear that people have, let alone singing, anything along those lines. But even just public speaking in their jobs, in their church, giving a toast at a wedding, whatever it is, people tend to agree that is something I feel uncomfortable with. So when you're a yoga teacher, you are a public speaker. Additionally, though, because we're teaching something that's been around for thousands of years, that has this whole story, this whole history, this whole philosophy, this whole framework of the 8 limbs, and a lot of the history of yoga is found in this canon of books and texts that are often challenging to read and understand. There's this additional level of knowledge that sometimes teachers feel they haven't yet acquired. And then I think additionally, and this is something that I can't speak to enough, it just comes up over and over again, there is a very strong, I want to say narrative, and that's oftentimes the word I use. I don't want to suggest that it's an intentional narrative, but part built into, and because I've been teaching for 22 years, I've seen this sort of continue to be. I can think back to 2002 when I started teaching today and all the years in between. And it's a common thread, this idea that there's a right way to teach yoga and there's a wrong way. And even though people don't say that explicitly, ask any teacher who's gone to a teacher training and they will leave that experience thinking there's a right way. And oftentimes that's coupled with, and I don't want people to get hurt in my classes, which in and of itself is a completely impossible goal because we're walking in a room with people we don't know. We have no, medical background or training. We're not being physicians to these people. We're being movement professionals. And to think that we can assume that we're never going to have anybody get hurt in our class is honestly laughable because we don't know anything about these people. The more we understand about anatomy, the more we appreciate we have to go in and teach things in an accessible way. And for God's sakes, be watching what they're doing. That's our best opportunity to correct the alignment or whatever else to do. But yet this is what teachers believe, that there's this right way and this wrong way. And so what that creates is this idea that there's a bar that's way up here and I got to meet this bar. And if I'm not meeting this bar, I'm somewhere else and it's not good enough. And when I go take so-and-so's class, she does blah, blah, blah. How come I can't do that? When I'm on social media, they do yada, yada. Maybe I should be doing that. So-and-so's changing their class every week. Maybe I should do that. But every time I do that, I get lost in the sequence and I feel really nervous. But I feel like I have to do that, right? There's all, when I talk to teachers, there's all of this verbiage that's such a tell. I have to do this. It's work. I should. I must. I have to mirror my students, but yet every time I do it, I get so confused. I stumble over the sequence and I'll say, well, what about experimenting with, putting the mirroring on the back burner? Well, but I have to mirror them. Well, says who? Well, that's what I was trained. Well, that's okay. That's an approach. It's not a thing that you have to do, especially if it's not working for you. Oh, really? Right? There's this wonderment that, you mean I don't need permission to do what I want to do? Even if doing it is creating this very negative outcome for me as a teacher. And that's, always what's so interesting to me, just from the study of people and behavior, is that in this world of teaching yoga, teachers will continue to go into the room and keep doing things and getting a bad outcome, but keep doing it because that pressure, that narrative, that story, that belief that they've picked up, that they maybe have been told, is so strong. So if I go in and I'm changing my sequence every week because I think they need it, because they're going to get bored if I don't do it, but every time I change it, every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I go through this angst of not knowing what comes next. And then every Sunday, I spend 3 hours writing out a new sequence and the whole cycle starts over again on Monday. And I never actually step back and say to myself, you know what? Maybe I should just stick with the same sequence until I get really comfortable with it. I mean, I liken it to if you were a Broadway performer and every Monday they gave you a new script, that would be crazy. But yet yoga teachers all over the world come to me and they say, my mind goes blank. I'm super nervous. I don't feel confident. And the first thing I'll always say is, sorry, how often are you changing your sequence? Oh, especially if we're on Zoom, here are my books of all the sequences I've written. And they'll proudly show me this pile of books, composition books or spiral bound books or journals with parchment paper and all of this. And I'm drawing the stick figures. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but let's look at the result. And even if the result is not just unsatisfactory, but filled with just angst and drama and pain, and women tell me, or people tell me about laying in bed the night before teaching, filled with terror over going to people that have class on Friday, and as soon as they wake up on Monday, they start to worry about the class. But yet, the belief is so strong from all of what they've heard and what they perceive when they go to so-and-so's class, and every time they go, it's different. Well, so maybe for that person, that works for that person. So all of that together is sort of the cocktail of variables that for many yoga teachers creates this experience that I just don't feel very confident. And we can look at it through the lens of teaching yoga, as we just have. We can also look at it just through the lens of, well, what are some things happening in everything we just talked about that are just human nature? And that sort of is what led me to start to think about, are there some things I've learned through working with yoga teachers that I could sort of take to even a more accessible way to start to share lessons with people that aren't even yoga teachers? Here are some ways that you can approach feeling more confident in your life. And that was what, led me to the creation of this new framework, the confidence practice.
It was like you're talking to myself 12 years ago, because I was that person who was writing every sequence down and comparing myself to every other teacher. Oh, this person's got fun music, or this person always does really weird variations of poses and people love it, and I've got to be that person. And I remember trying so hard to be somebody I wasn't, and I would step into a power yoga class and just feel so out of my depth, so unconfident. Mm-hmm. And it was only when I realized where my strengths were, where the people who really resonated with my teaching were, that I started to come into my own as a yoga teacher. But that comparison thing you talked about is so huge.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that is such a part of the common experience of yoga teachers. And it's natural, right? Whether it's yoga teaching or any other, keeping up with the Joneses type, mindset, it's a natural thing that humans do. And I think for yoga teachers, it's also exacerbated because a lot of the messaging yoga teachers get, which is well-founded, but unfortunately lands sort of sideways, is that everything needs to be framed and focused on the student's experience. So we want to go into class and say, what do you want to work on today? Or we want to go into class and say, well, only do this if it's to your liking or in your practice. Or, oh, you guys want to work on core today? Let's do that. Or, I'll change my sequence to keep them interested. Everything is very outwardly focused and focused on this seemingly lovely sentiment that we're there for them. Now, yes, we're there for them. That goes without saying, because we're walking in a room to give them, to be a guide, as we say, to the practice. The challenge, though, is if we take that mindset 100% to heart, we are always at the beck and call of this perception of whoever these people are. So in other words, as one example, if I go in and change my sequence every week out of belief that my students will get bored, even though my experience is I'm constantly feeling like I don't know what comes next. I have to practice with them, even though I want to be the kind of teacher who can do the walk and talk. I'm constantly very nervous. I don't feel confident. I'm doing that out of this belief that people will get bored if I don't change it. And so when I talk to teachers like this and they'll bring that up, I'll say, well, how do you know that they'll get bored? Oh, well, that's what I've heard. And I'll say, well, has anybody ever said to you, wow, your class is so boring, you do the same thing all the time? No. Well, have you ever heard of like Baron Baptiste and Bikram and Core Power Yoga? Like these studio empires are built on the model of teaching the same thing. Oh, yeah. And what about the students who hate that you change it all the time because they love the same thing, right? Like we can use logic to bust the belief, and no one ever really has these conversations with teachers. And so when you do, you start to realize, you know what? What if I went in there and did what I wanted to do, showed, taught the poses I love, taught it in a way that I feel really good and confident at doing it. Now I'm actually able in a paradoxical way, to be there for them more. Because now the tail isn't wagging the dog. Now I'm actually there feeling like I know what I'm doing, rather than being this people-pleasing person. But it's not called people-pleasing. In the yoga industry, it's called be there for your student, or, be compassionate, or do your own thing, only do, and I'm not sort of poo-pooing that, but I know, it's not like I feel it. I know from all the conversations I've had and the teachers I've worked with, that they take that to heart in a way that disempowers them as teachers. It doesn't empower them. Like, teachers will say to me, the example I gave, well, I go in and I say, well, what do you guys want to work on today? And I'm like, what? Like, what academic teacher would go into the classroom and say, what do you kids want to work on today? Nobody, right? But yet an extreme of this idea that puts the student experience so much at the forefront that the teacher becomes back on their heels, never there saying, this is what we're going to do today, because somehow that's been twisted into something that's bad or wrong, or lacking compassion, or lacking accessibility, when nothing could be further from the truth. If we want to be able to be there for all these people, many of whom we don't know, we want to be competent in what we're doing. And there's two main things we're doing. We're saying stuff, we're giving them the cues, and we're doing it in the context and the container of a sequence. Like, those are the two things. We can do a lot of other things too, but those are the two main things. And, when we get right down to it, those are the two. And we want to be able to do those things so well that we can sort of keep all these energetic balls in the air and be there for them, but not in a way that's what we're talking about here.
Do you think there are teachers out there who maybe can do that, who maybe have a really skilled, I'm not one of them personally, who could walk into a room and be like, hey, what do you want to do? And they tell them, and then they're able within their skill set to be able to do that. And then other people see it and think, well, that's what we're supposed to do.
Yeah.
But I don't have that ability to do that. But I know it's so common.
Yeah. I mean, that particular example is probably less common that I hear, although it is an extreme of what we're talking about here. If you look at it sort of on a continuum, on the more common end is what we're really talking about, which is more common, which is the changing the sequence all the time. But, even when you think about, and this is maybe a touchy one, but when people start out their classes, and again, I'm not saying this is bad or wrong, I'm just bringing it up for conversation. Does anybody have any injuries? Okay, so now what are we going to do with that? So Jane's going to say she has a rotator cuff tear. Bob's going to say he has a slip disc. So-and-so is going to say they pulled their hamstrings. So now what? So now we can just do the blanket thing and we can say, oh, take care of yourself. What does that really mean? Like, what is that? How is that really helpful? That's another thing I put in the bucket of stuff yoga teachers say that really means nothing. It's just something that we say that has a nice sort of vibe to it, but there's no teeth behind it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I've opened the door. Now I've said, tell me your problems. And so now what's the expectation that somehow in this group of a bunch of people, I'm going to now in the moment change my sequence to manage all these issues? Or maybe it's just to acknowledge that people have things going on and now they've had an opportunity to say it. Okay, great. I'm going to have eyes on you. I'm going to have eyes on. So that is a reasonable understanding. But then if you start practicing with them, that's a disconnect, because now these three folks have shared what their injuries are and you're not going to watch them. So if you're going to go in the room and say, tell me your problems, the partner to that in terms of your actions as a teacher is now to do the walk and talk and to have eyes on them. Now, the more we understand about anatomy as teachers, the more we realize there's really not a lot we can do. Even if we were to work with one of these people one-on-one, where we could customize things, where they could be speaking to us in the moment, like as they're moving around, it's just the two of us, they could be saying, that feels a little weird, or, whatever. But even when we know, we're not looking at imaging. We don't know. We're not doing range of motion testing. We don't know, the extent of their ABC. So again, there's this sort of real disconnect between the expectation and reality. And I think it's just another example where, again, the bar is perceived to be way up here. Like I go to a class and a teacher does that. Oh boy, am I supposed to be doing that? And this is, again, just fueled by a lot of things that teachers see and hear that just leads to this experience of, I don't really feel like I know what I'm doing, which is just another way of saying I'm not very confident.
It's funny because I take a lot of other movement types of classes, like, cardio and HIIT classes and things like that. And I mean, that idea of like saying your injuries ahead of time really doesn't come into play in those classes because, in my experience, it hasn't, because that personal trainer can't really do much. Like it's a hard class they planned. It's high intensity, these kind of things. But you're so right. It's so funny what we take as being the acceptable way of being a teacher, which in itself means that we're in a place of authority, guiding people with our knowledge and experience, and think that we have to sort of adapt it so that everybody feels, I don't know what the word is, but sort of we're too afraid to be who we are.
Yeah, I think what it boils down to in my hearing all this, as I talk to people, is a feeling of responsibility. The teacher feels responsible for the student. And oftentimes I talk about it. A friend of mine is an energetic healer, Kat Fowler. She has an amazing podcast. And she and I was talking one time, and she described to me this concept of an energetic cord. And you can think of it, I oftentimes think of it when friends of mine have kids that go away to college and they have all this angst about the kids leaving the house and they're going away to college. The parent has this energetic cord, obviously with their child, but the child's at the phase of life where they're going off to school, and both the child and the parent have to start to separate from this energetic cord. As yoga teachers, when we go into our class, number one, we're not responsible for our students. They are there of their own free will. We don't have to convince them to be there. We don't have to keep it interesting, stop it from being boring. We don't need to make the case about the yoga. They're there, especially in today's world when someone gets off their butt, gets in their car, drives to a studio, knowing all these online options they could do. They're there. They're psyched to be there, right? So that's part one. But part two is this energetic cord where we feel this responsibility is something that, again, is oftentimes couched in this industry verbiage that you don't want people to get hurt in your classes, and you're there for them, and you're a guide, but they need to listen to their bodies, but you need to know what's going on, and you don't want to get them hurt. So it's all this mixed messaging, and all of a sudden the teacher is like, wow, I'm responsible for them. And there's the liability form, and I'm paying for liability insurance. So in the back of my mind, I'm like, well, what if they get hurt? Is it my fault? And so totally different from when you're working with a personal trainer and it's just you and them and you're doing physical fitness. And I have my personal training background and certification. I had to take a test to become a certified personal trainer. We don't have to take a test in yoga. We could go down that whole path. So in reality, I think we need to really examine this idea of responsibility, which for many yoga teachers is where the pressure comes from. So there's the lack of experience, the lack of feeling confident, and also the feeling of pressure, right? I go into the class, I've got this beginner in the front of the room. Now I don't feel like I can teach the sequence I came to teach because that person in the first 10 minutes, I can see them flopping all over the mat. I'm freaked out. I'm worried this person's going to get hurt. And I often say to teachers when they describe, because I get this scenario all the time, you don't even know what that person's thinking. They could be so happy that they are in yoga, flopping on the mat. They don't even care. They're like, woohoo, I'm doing yoga. I'm surrounded by these yogi people who I always wanted to be surrounded by. And that could be their experience. So you thinking that you're worrying about them and they're going to get hurt and blah, blah, blah is assumption. And this, again, when you were talking before about nobody's talking back, we're in this sort of conversation with ourselves, even though people are there. because of that dynamic, teachers oftentimes make a lot of assumptions about what they think the student's feeling. Oh, she gave me a weird look, or she didn't want that block I put down when she was in twisting triangle, blah, blah, blah. And, Deepak Chopra wrote a book, I think it's like, or maybe, no, the Four Agreements book, which is
Miguel Ruiz.
Yeah, Ruiz, right? Don't make assumptions is one of the Four Agreements. And this really applies here. When we're making assumptions, it just feeds oftentimes all these beliefs that we have that really get in the way of being confident in what our role is. Like when I go in to teach a class, when I go in, I am there for the students, but not in a way where I'm like a helicopter mom, where I feel responsible for them. When I see a student who somebody else might perceive as struggling, I just watch them more. I just give clearer cues. I focus on action cues. In my teaching methodology, I talk about action, alignment, anatomy, and somatic as the 4 types of cues. So if I got a bunch of beginners, I'm going to give a lot of action cues. Action cues are only going to help the people who are more experienced because it's like just more essential, right? It's not very, it doesn't require a lot of interpretation. So it's not like I'm catering to them, but again, it's just you're going in and you're more, I often make the metaphor, make the analogy to think of a flight attendant. If a flight attendant went into every shift and took on all of the angst of all of the people, the gate agent, they would quit after a week. They need to go in and do that job. Even doctors and nurses, right? That's even a better example. And just be somewhat permeable. You need to just kind of be able to just operate in your role without taking on this feeling of responsibility, which sounds like a great thing. I want to be responsible. I'm not saying don't be responsible, but be responsible for what you can control. Are you walking around the room? Do you know the why behind the cues? Do you understand anatomy? Are you watching your students? Did you hydrate before class? Are you grounded? All the things you can control help them more, not bending over backwards to change the sequence all the time and worry about all those things seem great and are supported by the stories that they hear, but they actually hurt the teacher, which inevitably hurts the student's experience. But yet it's sort of the paradox, and we don't often frame it this way. And yet, one of the core practices that I have with the teachers I work with is experimenting, right? Even though we talk about things and I sort of try to bust the belief a little bit in conversation, I don't try to convince them. I'll say, look, just experiment. Go into the next 5 classes, use the same sequence and see what happens. If that's the topic we're talking about. And inevitably, I'll have the teachers come back and they'll be like laugh crying. They'll be like, I can't believe no one said anything. No one complained. No one raised the hand. No one said boo. The only thing that changed is I feel like I actually know what I'm doing. And they're literally like laugh crying. They're just like, I can't even believe. I remember I talked to this one woman and she was not only practicing basically the entire sequence with her class, even the stuff on the belly and on the back. And I was like, you're doing like locust and wheel with your students? She's like, yeah. And it was in her saying it that she started to like laugh hysterically because she realized how absurd it was. But she was so attached to the belief that I must be practicing with my students that even though her voice was challenged, her vocal quality, like you're doing yoga and you're trying to talk and have your voice be clear and you're upside down and you're on your belly. It's, when you go to spin class, it affects them. They're doing it all, right? But as yoga teachers, we don't need to do that. And when our voice is one of our primary tools, it only helps our students, when we're clear. And I know some of your listeners are going to be like hearing this and thinking, but my students are visual learners, because that's the other belief. Well, they need me to do it. And I always find this one so interesting because I'll say, well, how do you know they're visual learners? Are you like doing any cognitive testing when they come in? Like, visual learner. learner or are you an auditory learner? And they'll go, oh, that's so funny. No, of course not. So how do you know that they're visual? Well, because they watch me when I do it. And I'll say, well, is that because you're doing it? Well, yeah. Well, have you ever experimented with walking around? And well, yeah, I have. But every time I walk around, they're looking at me, just like imploring me with their eyes to keep doing it. Right. So this is where you're at the fork in the road. Are you going to be a teacher or are you going to be a follower? Are you going to do what you want to do in service to them, not in a selfish way? Right. It's kind of like a mom saying, eat your vegetables. Well, I don't want my vegetables. Well, they're good for you. Right. As a teacher, number one, if your students are visual learners, whoever those people are in your class you don't know, wouldn't it be great to teach them how to learn in an auditory way? That's like a whole new sense of neural pathways and neuroplasticity. Now they can drop into their practice and they don't even need to look at you. Like, wouldn't that be an amazing transformation for that student? For you as a teacher, now I can walk around, right? For the students who are used to you practicing with them, now they can disconnect from having to watch you all the time. Now they can start to, really the same as the other student, drop in and feel what's going on and all of that good stuff. So all of these beliefs can be busted with logic. Mm-hmm. All beliefs can, in general. Belief is just something that you tell yourself over and over again until you think it's true, right? And in this context, we're talking about teaching yoga, but we can look at any belief and do that with it. So, these kinds of conversations are not common. And that's why a lot of the teachers I talk to, they'll say, how come nobody's ever talked to me like this? How come nobody's ever had the, and I'll say, well, I'm glad we're having it now. I just have a very, I want to say quirky, but I just have a very different way of looking at what we do. And that informs a lot of my teaching methodology, which informs a lot of the way I work with teachers, which leads to a lot of these conversations I have on podcasts or on social media. And teachers will just say, wow, this is just really different, but it's really curious. Like sometimes they'll say, I'm just really curious about this. I just never actually thought that, again, because so much of the way the teachers are trained is they go to somebody, that person says, do it this way, ba, 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 and they leave and they think, well, that's the way it should be done. Without realizing, well, that's just somebody's method. That's just there's really no right way to do this. Like nobody's in your class auditing your class. Maybe you work for a studio or a teacher listening works for a studio where somebody is in their class every once in a while. That's a little bit of a one-off. But in general, no one's in charge of this, right? It's been around for thousands of years. We can do it how we want. Again, the confident teacher is the one who starts to move in that direction. And that's really, where oftentimes some of the really amazing rewards come, to the person, that feeling of I'm really doing what I want to do, I'm doing it in a way that really feels authentically me, like I'm watching people at the end in Shavasana and I'm just knowing I'm doing exactly what I was meant to do. Like there is no question, I just feel like I can go home and go to bed and I've just done good work.
You bring up a really good point about it can be a very isolating experience being a yoga teacher. Like we do a training, we're taught how to teach, and then we go out there and we teach, and we might spend years feeling like we're not good enough. You actually shared with me before we began recording about a communication you had recently that I'd love for you to share more of, about the importance of, I guess it's like svadhyaya, like this self-study and this willingness to be open to change and to know that there is a possibility of feeling confident and competent and, like you just said, good about your work, like I'm doing the right thing. So it was such a powerful thing that you shared. I'd love to talk about that again.
Sure. So recently I got into a conversation on Instagram in the DMs and the direct messages with this woman who was interested in my monthly membership. She had seen a post about the Yoga Teacher Confidence Club. And so I just started a dialogue with her. And I always just asked something general, like, how are your classes going? And she said, they're going good. I just feel like I'd like to be more of the kind of teacher who could just walk in the room and spontaneously teach without necessarily sticking to such a rigid plan. And I'd like to be able to walk around more. And I think I might have asked, okay, I think I might have said something like, oh, that sounds like such a great vision. I love that. When did you start teaching? And she wrote me back and she said, I've been teaching for 19 years. And when I saw that, my first thought was, oh my God, what have you been waiting for? Like, what have you been waiting for? But yet the human experience is filled with scenarios like this. I was listening to a podcast recently, and the person was talking about, he was a physician, and he was talking about oftentimes people at end of life talk about their regrets in life being more around a way of being they wished they had that they didn't have. Like, I wish I wasn't so controlling, or I wish I didn't nitpick my husband so much, whatever it is, more than I wanted that car. I wish I went to Paris, right? And so when I heard this from this teacher, it just highlighted for me this idea of, we can know as yoga teachers that we're missing the mark in our own way, not as measured by anybody else or some outside. We can just feel in our heart, I'm doing this. This doesn't feel natural. But it kind of reminds me of that Taylor Swift song, I'm the problem, it's me, right? If I'm the problem, it's me. I can't see myself out of the problem, right? There's that saying, it's attributed to Einstein, you can't think yourself out of a problem that you created. You can't think yourself, and yoga teaching is very much like this. And this is, again, part of what makes it a unique experience. And I always say to teachers, if you haven't already figured it out, don't talk to your partner about your problems as a yoga teacher, because they won't get it. They'll typically say something like, oh, it's not rocket scientist. Why don't you just get over it? And unless Brene Brown says, or I think it's attributed to Tom Brady brings up the quote too. It's not Einstein. I forget who. Roosevelt, I think. You have to be in the arena. Unless you're in the arena, you don't really have a leg to stand on. Like, don't talk to me about it's not rocket brain science, get over it. You're not a yoga teacher. And that goes back to what we talked about earlier. You really can't appreciate what it's like until you do it. And when you start teaching yoga and you start getting into this quandary of, I'm not feeling confident and I'm not feeling like this is working for me, you're the problem. And so you can't see yourself out of it, because you're not really, even if you have great self-awareness and you're journaling and all that, it requires, because many times what's behind it is this belief system. And until, kind of like these little belief busting examples we've done in this conversation here, until you have someone else's perspective, often a coach like me, who can say, well, what about this? Well, what about that? Have you experimented? You'll just stay in that same iterative loop. Right? It's just like the teacher who knows it's not working for her, but she'll keep going into the room with a new sequence out of the belief. If no one's challenging the belief, the behavior won't change. And so this is, the same thing with this teacher for 17 years. I mean, imagine 17 years of feeling some level of dissatisfaction with what you're doing. And it's not even just dissatisfaction, it's denying the world the opportunity to experience you in the most expressive, authentic way. So, that's why I often say my ultimate mission is get as many yoga teachers out there teaching in a way that is completely easy and fun and empowering to them. Because when you teach in that way, it just continues to, it's like the ripple effect. It's easy for you. You teach your class. The people in your class have a great experience. Hopefully we can't control that, but we're in a better position to give them a good experience. And they go home and they relate to their family better, their work. It's that whole ripple effect. And, when we're at cause to teach in a way that is truly confident, we are better positioned to create that ripple.
I love that. What also is really powerful about that story is that there's a lot of love there for that person who contacted you too for 17 years to feel that way, but to continue to
Yes.
teach yoga just shows you that the drive and the fire is there. It's just that occasionally, or maybe not occasionally, we need help from people like yourself to help us. And the other really important thing you said was like, find your own way of teaching what feels empowering to you, what, like your own spin on that by being given these tools that you are sharing with the people in your programs is huge.
Yeah. And the interesting thing when we were kind of wrapping up the conversation, and this is all through messaging, so I obviously can't see her, which is, I'm at a disadvantage. But at the end of the whole thing, I said, because I always like to pose questions to empower the person. So we talked a little bit. I got her background. I reiterated, well, this would be perfect for you. It's $29 a month. You'd be part of the Yoga Teacher Conference. And we talk about this. I can help you create different ways to do what you want to do. And so she wrote back, I'll think about it. Right. So I wrote her back and I said, sounds good. Don't think too long, because imagine you could be closer than you think. Right. Mm-hmm. Because the thinking, this is why I'm always really aware of the verbiage that yoga teachers use. So when someone says to me, I'll think about it, the reason they're going to think about it is because that part of them that's been driving them to keep doing the same thing for 19 years, that part's really loud. But there's another part that's like, you don't have to do that anymore. You can really be the teacher you want to be. But that voice is overtaken by the other voice. So when someone says, I'll think about it, it's often because they're battling between those two parts of them. And this is like the bud turning into the rose, the person stepping forward, the empowered part saying, you know what? I'm going to try this. I'm going to experiment with this. And keep in mind, it's $29. It's not $2,500. So this is just an example of how strong the pull can be against change. Because
it's comfortable, right? We're not this is the moment. If you're listening to this podcast and you've resonated with a lot of what's been shared so far, and I think this is the moment. This is the important moment where it's like, you can make a change by joining the program, by, putting down the $29. You can only gain. There's nothing to lose from trying something different. I think if you're that person, because I'm often that person when I listen to podcasts and I'm like, oh, I'll think about it. Like, don't think about it. Just do it.
And that's exactly what I said to her. I said, the link is in my bio on Instagram. It's $29. The worst it'll be is $30 down the tubes and you'll hate it. But I don't think that's going to happen.
and sometimes just just joining, like just purchasing it is the powerful move you need to get you into that space where you can be different if you want to be.
Totally. And I know I talked before about transformational classes versus transactional ones. In this way, sometimes the transformation is in the transaction being the exchange of money. Because when you take out your credit card to enroll in any program, whatever it is, a yoga teacher trainer, whatever it is, that paying the money is part of you saying to yourself, I want to do this. I can do this. So it's part of the experience of transforming, shifting from where you are now to where you want to be. If it were free, it would not have the same impact on you from not an integrity standpoint, just the composition of who you are as a person. And you probably, people do free stuff all the time and it has very little impact because they had no teeth in it.
Totally. No, I love, and as we, because I think this is a good moment for us to sort of begin winding down. I'd love for you to share a little bit more, maybe about, like, we'll put obviously the links for the programs and also for your books and your website and things in there. But if you could say anything to anybody out there who was like edging towards maybe like, oh, this could be for me, what would be maybe a couple of things you might say to them?
Yeah. So what I would say is similar to what we talked about before, this idea of, if the thought is there that you have a way of being that you want to shift to, and that could be as a person, as a yoga teacher, because remember, when you go in to teach your class, you're bringing all of you in there. So in your work to be a better yoga teacher, better however you describe it, you will have a better relationship. You will develop a better relationship with yourself, because being a yoga teacher really is a journey in self-transformation. And if you're willing, right, and this gets to what all the stuff we've been talking about, if you're willing to keep challenging yourself and keep experimenting with different things so that you can find your most authentic way of teaching, you will be busting the beliefs along the way that have been ruling your behaviors and start to really emerge. It's almost like that. Actually, I sometimes use the metaphor of the sword from the stone, right? The sword will come out of the stone, right? And now there you are, like, right? You're right there. And so if there is that feeling that there's something there, certainly the membership that I have is a great step. And like you said, $29 a month, very low risk. That link will be in the show notes. It's also right off my Instagram, Bare Bones Yoga, right there in the bio. And, in general, I would say is when we talked earlier about, my framework of the confidence practice, it's got just these different components, and experimentation is one of them. And just trying different things and having good daily habits and self-inquiry and meditation and visualization. These are all parts of the framework. And the idea is feeling confident is a practice. It's not like we're here, like here I am, and that's never going to change. Of course, you're changing. We know as yoga teachers, we're always evolving. It's part of the Buddhist philosophy. And so feeling confident throughout our life is a practice, and it's grounded on different things that we can do so that we're always putting ourselves in the best position to be operating out there in the world from that place of confidence.
I love it. This is your sign. And also, Karen will be one of the speakers at the March 22nd online yoga conference. So if you're even just curious about finding out more about what it is that Karen can share with us, then you'll be able to experience that as well. Thank you so much for being here today. There's so many questions I could ask you. I think we could talk for probably like 3-4 hours without stopping. But this was a great intro, and hopefully, yeah, exactly. Hopefully we'll have you back, and you'll be at the conference as well. So plenty of opportunities. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.